countries. So this is just one example, but I think it's an important one because it shows how the very organization of property relation, is something that should not be taken as given and can be organized in multiple manners. And things have changed a lot, again, it's not only in Germany or Sweden. Even if you take in the US, UK today, being an owner today doesn't mean the same thing as being an owner in the 19th century. In the 19th century, if you are an owner, you own a building, or you own a house, or you own a firm, you can just throw the tenant away, multiply the rent by 10, divide the wage by 2, from one day to the other. Today, this is not something you can do. So the very notion of what it means to be an owner and how you organize the relation to different groups has very little to do today with 1 century ago, and it will keep changing in the future. And I think this is really what I want to put at the forefront of the discussion.
So, I mean, you mentioned the orthodoxy that took hold in the 80s and 90s. I'm interested in how the window ended in the 1970s. Some people make the argument that it was the over-generousness of the New Deal settlement in the US and the creation of big social security systems in Europe that sowed the seeds of the stagflation of the 1970s, the crippling strikes in the UK and elsewhere. What's your explanation about how and why this window of social democracy closed?
Well, first, again, it did not close completely in the sense that the system today, is still very, very different from a century ago. And so, I really want to stress that, there's a long-term process toward domesticating capital and toward regulating property and economic forces, and there's a long-run process toward the reduction of inequality, which is very much a reality. And I think it's important, otherwise people get depressed and feel, sure. I think it's important to emphasize, the positive impact in the long run, because this is also what will help us understand why it is perfectly feasible to renew this. So what changed in the 70s, 80s? I think there are several factors, but probably the fall of communism, Soviet communism, but also the gigantic failure of communism in China under Mao, and the complete change in perspective starting in the 1980s was probably the most important factor in the long run. Of course, there are other factors as well. The fact that when welfare states become much bigger, naturally they come under criticism, and you need in power, the social democrat and the center right, it's legitimate that they alternate in power and they have different views about the welfare state. And once you have a welfare state that takes 40-50% of GDP, it's perfectly legitimate that it comes under attack, and we sort of need to prove permanently that it is working well, that sometimes it needs to be reformed, it needs to be made even more efficient in terms of quality of public services. I mean, I think in the end, there's a lot of evidence that you can make a system of public health, public education, public transportation work much better than a private system. That's particularly obvious if you think of the health system, which is a key issue in today's crisis, and in the US, they managed to spend much more than every other country with their private health system, and with very bad performance in terms of public health statistics. And I think it's clear that a public system, well organized, well managed, can be superior. But the discussion needs to take place, and it's perfectly legitimate starting in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s that you have a permanent debate about how to make the welfare state more efficient. That could not take place 50 years before when there was no welfare state. Now, this in itself is not surprising. It's not a problem. What made a much bigger change in the course of action, I think, is more the rise of Reaganism and Thatcherism in US, UK, which I think has a lot to do with some form of nationalism, so to speak, in the sense that in what was very important, I think, for the rise of Reagan and Thatcher was the feeling that the US and the UK were being overtaken, or there was a catch-up process, like Germany, Japan, but also France, Italy were catching up with US, UK, and which in the end was something natural in a way, given how much World War I and World War II had put continental Europe and Japan below the US, in particular in terms of per capita GDP. So there was to be a catch-up, but somehow this was instrumentalized very efficiently by Reagan and in a different manner Thatcher in order to push for a very different agenda in the 1980s. And at the end of the 1980s, the fall of Soviet communism and the complete reorientation of Chinese communism coincided with this change going on in the West to produce a sort of enormous ideological shift, which today I think we're still not completely out of this. And in particular, Russia and China, are two countries where the post-communist disillusion leads these countries to complete. They don't even try. The idea of reducing inequality and having a sort of more egalitarian and internationalist objective is something that is completely out of sight in this country. So in Putin's Russia, there's no progressive income tax of any kind. You have the income tax is 13%, 1/3 on every income. Whether you have 100 rubles per month or 1 billion rubles per month. Even Donald Trump would not dare proposing this. In the US, you have to look as if you're proposing at least a little bit of tax progressivity, say 5% tax rate for the lowest income, 25-30% for the highest income, but you cannot just say flat tax 13% like what Putin will do in Russia. In Russia and actually also in China, there's no progressive tax of inheritance. In fact, there's no tax on inherited wealth of any sort. So, you privatize most of the assets very often to the benefits of groups very close to the people in power. And then these people can transmit these assets to their family and children with absolutely zero tax. And Hong Kong is the incredible example of a country that has become even more unequal and that has actually repealed its inheritance tax after becoming communist or after joining a country dominated by the Communist Party of China. And today, if you die in Asia and you want to transmit a large wealth in Asia, you should go and die in China, in communist China. If you go to Taiwan or to capitalist South Korea or to capitalist Japan, you will actually pay an inheritance tax of 50% on large wealth. Whereas in China it will be 0%. So the fact that the two countries, China and Russia, that have gone through a communist experiment, have now moved to the complete opposite of very large reliance on tax havens and no progressive taxation of any kind. I think this has a huge impact on the global balance and the global ideology, so to speak, and I think it's this has consequences well beyond Russia and China. This has consequences for policy debate in India, in Africa, in Latin America. So I think this is, if we have a long run perspective on inequality regime, the fall of communism was just 30 years ago. So, it's not so long ago. And if we take a long-run perspective, we still are in this post-communist era. Also, the fact that many newly independent countries, in particular in Africa, were not so successful sometime in the 60s, 70s with their sort of quasi-socialist strategy. I say quasi-socialist strategy because in practice, these development strategies, well, first, it all happened very fast. This was as you were saying before, building a state on the shoulders of the colonial state in the very complicated political and historical circumstances of the immediate post-colonial era was extremely challenging, with huge demographic expansion, and it all happened sort of very quickly. But in the end, the fact that in the 70s, 80s, with the economic crisis, some of these economic strategies were not as successful. Probably there was excessive hope of a very fast catch-up through very, voluntaristic economic policies. In the end, the failures of these strategies was obviously instrumentalized by sort of conservative economic ideologies, both within these countries and in the world arena. And again, we are still very much in the aftermath of this period. So I think now we are hopefully ready to enter a new era, but this has really started to change only after the 2008 financial crisis. So it's only 10 years ago, and maybe this the current sanitary crisis will also contribute to trigger this change.
Last question, because I know you have to go. Danny Roderick contrasts that sort of period of post-war to the 1970s, and he broadly calls it globalization, and broadly, it was positive. And the following 30 years, I think you call it hyperglobalization. And in that period, the sort of local political domestic considerations had to give way to international capital, and the pace of change in industries suddenly exposed to India and Chinese workforces was so quick, very painful. Now it's obviously nothing new to see in this pain the seeds of Trump, the seeds of Brexit. But I'm interested in how do we let it happen? Who are the chief culprits? And I think your book takes aim at centre-left parties here, and also sort of circling back to our idea of what could be taken from this particular moment once we've dealt with the very human cost of the pandemic. If it's possible to work on this idea of globalization and bring back and in some way regulate the exchanges between countries. Because while I agree within a country, yes, you can no longer turf people out, and cut the wages in half. Between countries, regulation is so light, and obviously there's a lot more to be said about financialization. But just on that globalization issue, what do you think?
Right. So I think there are three main limitations in the sort of social democratic agenda of the post-war period, which explain the difficulties that the social democratic forces have had in recent decades. So these three limitations are about education, property, and globalization is probably the most important. So education, I stress in my book the fact that with the rise of higher education, the social democratic parties were unable or unwilling to redefine an objective of educational justice, and there's a lot about that in my book. Property, I think there was an inability of social democratic parties, to extend the notion of social property, workers' rights, co-determination, circulation of property. So I talk about universal capital endowment, sharply progressive taxation of large wealth holdings. So that's another dimension. Now, the third limitation, which you are alluding to, and which is probably the most important of all, has to do with the organization of globalization. And I think social democratic parties worldwide, they were always internationalist in practice, but in fact they were very nationalist in their actual policy strategy and the organization of their policy package, in the sense that they never really tried to develop a notion of international taxation or international labor law. I mean, there was some attempt, starting with the international